From Geppetto Studios in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, welcome to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, your home for inclusive, positive geek culture, where we talk about movies, comics, music, books, and whatever else we feel like. Please welcome your host.
It's the first man I've ever seen. I'm completely in love. All future printings had the penis shaded out, destroying planets through cosmic orgasm.
Brad Mendenhall.
Hey kids, it is episode 238 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. It's a saucy episode as our favorite expert of the world of superhero sexuality, Dr. Anna Peppard, joins me to discuss whether or not Batman, does that. We keep the language clean, but we do talk about adult subject matter. Might want to send the kids to another room. Anywho, Chris Maverick and Sarah Black are here for a special Crossing the Streams.
Cross the streams.
I love this plan. I'm excited to be a part of it. Let's do it.
The circle could be clever, except that they made it dumb on purpose.
Yeah.
Like the circle is it's a reality show where you're voting people off the island kind of thing. But instead of voting off the island, they stick you in there's an apartment building, right? And they lock you in one room of the apartment building for 6 weeks, like you're by yourself. And you can only interact with other people in the apartment building, but only in this private social media chat thing they have. So people are and every week somebody gets voted out, and people are lying about who they are. So like some people are being, I am so and so.
And some are lying and some are telling the truth, and you have to try to figure that out. So you're only communicating with people through mediated channels. You're not really seeing, yeah.
And you're trying to vote out all the catfish, and one person at the end gets $100,000. That could be interesting, and it is kind of interesting, but then they've also produced it they've picked the most mindless people ever to be on the show. Like there's a lot of catty idiots that are just there because they want there to be drama.
People who want to be on reality shows are the worst people on the planet.
Right. They've tried to find the worst for this show in order to make it interesting. Like they're backstabbing each other, and people are like, "Oh, I can't believe I thought we were friends." I'm like, "You've never met these people. You're talking on a chat room. It's not even like you're talking in a chat room like you've been talking and friends online for years. You've been friends online since Tuesday."
Right.
In the context of a game. And then the other one, Too Hot to Handle, is they get a whole bunch of really, really sexy 20-somethings, and they stick them on an island together, and they tell them, and it's only I think it's 3 weeks or 4 weeks long. And it's basically how can you hang out on this island for 3 weeks? And every time everybody loses money.
Wow. That's interesting. I haven't seen that one.
I've heard of that.
Yeah, there's a prize of there's 16 of them, right? Or 12 of them or 16 of them, whatever. And 8 women, 8 men, and they're all ridiculously, they're all models, and they're all the oldest one is 30, they're all aged 21 through 30, 31. They all have perfect bodies, and then it's and there's constant alcohol, and they're party it up. But if you kiss somebody, the pot goes down. If you have sex, the pot goes down. And every time anybody hooks up, the group pot that everybody shares goes down. But there's you have these little wristwatches they give you. If the AI that runs the show, that hosts the show, determines that you are making what in its judgment is an honest connection, they might turn your watch red or green, because your watch is red. It might turn green for a moment, and then you can have physical intimacy for as long as the watch is green, which is long enough to kiss somebody. I believe that I could have sex while the watch was green. I believe, given the challenge, if I was waiting for the moment. But that's the whole show, and it's just them, and it's people going, "Screw it! The money's how can I not have sex for 3 weeks?" And I'm like, "F you."
3 weeks. Clearly, they're in their 20s, not in their 40s.
I don't know that I ever in my 20s voluntarily didn't have sex for 3 weeks, but there were certainly times where it happened. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
But it was something definitely in the cards.
I'm glad you survived that experience.
clearly, if I were a guy with a guy with 3% body fat, which is what several of the guys look like, or a girl who was 95 pounds with triple D size breasts, like then I apparently wouldn't be able to resist sex for 3 weeks.
Then it's just something constantly on the menu. It's like, okay, I guess this is just something that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Sex again.
So that's what I watch. Those are the kinds of things that I watch. Like, it's 2 a.m. What's on Hulu? What's on Netflix? I highly recommend those.
I have my favorite guests. One person who has quickly risen to the top of that list is Dr. Anna Peppard. Doc, how you doing?
Yeah, hanging in there. Weather's getting hotter outside, trying to stay cool. Finally finished teaching a superheroes course. Just submitted my marks a few days ago, so I'm able to catch up on some reading and do some writing, so I'm happy about that.
I always try to think, it's like, how am I going to get Anna back on? And then, almost like manna from heaven, the story comes out. The creators for the HBO Max show Harley Quinn were being interviewed by Variety magazine, and I'm just going to read it. Justin Halpern, one of the co-creators, said, "In the 3rd season of Harley, we had a moment where Batman was going down on Catwoman, and DC was like, you can't do that. You absolutely cannot do that. They're like, heroes don't do that." This started a whole deluge of social media activity. Now, it's really a thing of it was slow news day.
Yeah.
If there was a lot of craziness going on in the news, I don't think this would have gotten its traction, but it got a lot of people talking. When I heard that, it's like, all right, well, who do I know who's an expert on superhero sexuality, who literally wrote the book Super Sex? And here's Anna Peppard back with us.
Yeah, always fun for me when something like that happens, and then you get people sort of realizing the complexity of super sex for the first time, which is both interesting and boring for me, since it's something I think about a lot. But I mean, also just the kind of conversations that it inspires are always interesting. It took about a day for Dave Cockrum's son to post pictures from his father, Dave Cockrum's notebooks, showing that Nightcrawler, my fave, definitely does do that. Got tagged on that by a couple of people, and I believe I'd even seen the images before, like on a fan forum, so always happy to see it again. Always happy to know that my fave, at least, isn't a selfish lover like Batman, so interesting convos.
I think this might be the better side of social media. You just have so many people, for everyone from Batman writers to Val Kilmer, posting stuff on social media. It's like, no, my Batman does that.
It's just such an easy story to dunk on, I think, is like partly, like it's ideal for social media because it's ideal for like jokes and like memes and like, it's just perfect. That's like partly, I think, why something like that explodes. It makes everybody happy to dunk on this story.
I think what helps is these stories come out every now and then, and good grief, there have been very 13-year-old boy conversations about superhero sexuality. Basically, what you do, but dumb. Heck, I remember the Kevin Smith movie, Mallrats, where you had Jason Lee's character talking with Stan Lee about, oh, what about the Thing? What does he look like? And can Mr. Fantastic do such and such? Jason Lee's character was supposed to be immature. But those conversations have been going on for years. But this was actually a very interesting, and it's still a little salacious, which helps it grab headlines. But there also is what kind of lover is Batman? And the idea that a hero wouldn't debase himself, and they tweaked it because the people at DC, it wasn't that he was a selfish lover, it's that we sell consumer toys for heroes. It's hard to sell a toy if Batman is also going down on someone.
The wording of that tells you everything you need to know. I mean, keeping it within the realm of Kevin Smith. I mean, Kevin Smith did a Batman comic called Batman Widening Gyre, where Batman and Silver St. Cloud have sex, and it's canon, it's in the comic, and we're told in the comic by Kevin Smith that he made her come 10 times the first time they slept together. We're not told how he did that, but we're going to assume it wasn't going down on her because heroes don't do that. So they don't have a problem with heroes having sex. They just seem to have a problem with heroes having certain kinds of sex. And I'll walk that back a little bit. They do have problems with heroes having sex, especially Batman, which goes back to this whole like legacy of the comics code and Frederick Wortham being worried that the adventures of Batman and Robin were homoerotically salacious and all of this stuff. So Batman's sexuality has always been particularly carefully managed within the superhero genre, but still, like, they have let Batman have sex in comics, like in the DC canon universe before. It's this sex act they seem to have an issue with.
That particular story that you're talking about, Widening Geyer, the only reason that happened was because it was Kevin Smith.
Yeah, that's a good point.
He's a bit of an 800-pound gorilla in the world of comics. He has horrible delays. That particular comic was drawn by Walt Flanagan, who's a personal friend of Kevin Smith, who's not a very good artist, but is Kevin Smith's friend, so Kevin Smith wants him to do it. And even when Kevin Smith started a mini-series in Marvel, Daredevil the Target, he basically wanted to do this mini-series. He put out the first issue. It was going to focus on the rivalry, the animosity between Daredevil and Bullseye. And because he was doing this comic, no one else was allowed to use Bullseye because Kevin Smith is using Bullseye. The second issue of the comic never came out. It's been like 15, 20 years since that came out. And basically kept Bullseye, Daredevil's arch nemesis, on ice for so long. I don't think anyone else would have been able to get away with that particular little anecdote except for Kevin Smith. And it was weird and
it was weird. Yeah, I'm not debating that. I don't consider that like a sex positive series necessarily, despite the fact that at least on panel she says she very much enjoyed the sex. It was a very immature treatment of sexuality, but definitely an example of they have let sexuality happen in Batman comics before.
I'm trying to think if there are any other heroes in comics or characters in comics, in mainstream comics, in Marvel, DC, who has as much fan interest in their sexuality as Batman.
Yeah.
People are really curious about Batman. Not that long ago, the Black Label created a stir because...
Yeah, it was Batman Damned #1 from DC's Black Label imprint, which is their mature readers imprint. So back in October 2018, the first issue of Batman Damned #1 included an on-panel image of Batman's penis. Now, this is a mature readers imprint. It is labeled like that specifically for sex and violence and language. This created a huge uproar, and to the extent that DC pulled the comic, they censored it. All future printings had the penis shaded out. And I'll note, too, about this one, it was not a sexual scene. It was a scene in which Bruce Wayne was taking off his costume to like have his computer scan him for knife wounds and had to be naked, so his penis was like incidentally visible. But I think in that case, that almost made people more uncomfortable because it was this context of kind of intimacy and vulnerability, and I could see that making people more uncomfortable if they're inclined to be uncomfortable about the sight of male nudity in general, which, because our culture is messed up, just has homophobic connotations in general. So they pulled it, and Jim Lee, who was the co-president of DC Comics at that time, along with Dan DiDio, he actually provided cover art for like variant covers for that series, and yet he claimed to not know about it and blamed it on production errors.
Oh my God.
No responsibility for it happening. Dan DiDio said that it was going to cause them to fundamentally rethink what their goals were for the Black Label imprint because they don't want that type of attention. So yeah, a lot of prudishness there.
I mean, people are just interested in Batman's sex life. If one thing, he isn't nearly as chaste as some other characters. Superman, it was always like a longing for Lois Lane, but up until relatively recently, never allowing him to have that relationship. Peter Parker was presented as sort of young and innocent and having like making googly eyes at Mary Jane Watson or Gwen Stacy or whatever. Even when they matured the character a little bit and hadn't married, he was never viewed as a playboy billionaire Bruce Wayne, and he sort of lived that life. So he always had a lot of girlfriends. And I'm trying to think if there are any other, maybe Tony Stark.
I was going to say, yeah.
But Iron Man, up until relatively recently, never had nearly as much cachet in the world of comics. Iron Man comics never sold as much as Batman comics.
Yeah, you can get away with more like with a character like that because he just doesn't have the notoriety and sort of the cultural footprint that Batman does. Like Batman is a more valuable property, and I mean that's changed a little bit with the MCU movies, but I mean still, even with that, like Iron Man's not the property that Batman is. I mean, I out of characters who are sexually active in the Marvel universe, I don't think there can be much debate that in comics at least, and in the films as well, but definitely in comics, Tony Stark is the biggest playboy. I mean, if you've read the 1980s Iron Man comics at all, it's like every single issue he has a new girlfriend and like they're shown waking up together in bed in a penthouse. I mean, it's not subtle.
Oh, and he would have 2 or 3 girlfriends.
Yeah, he just, yeah.
It wasn't like a James Bond movie where James Bond, the whole thing in James Bond, he sleeps with 1 or 2 women at the beginning of the movie, and then he meets the love of that movie, and then the next movie, it all starts again with a new girlfriend. It's not like Tony Stark would have a girlfriend for 2-3 issues, and then he would have a new girlfriend for 2-3 issues. It was, Tony had like an actress who he was dating, a hairstylist that he was dating, and then the woman who shot him that he was dating, all at the same time.
Yeah, like in those comics from the 80s, it'll just be like, he'll call up whatever girl is like living in whatever city he happens to be visiting that day, and they have a booty call. And then in the next issue, he might be in a different city and he hooks up with a different girl. That wasn't considered a problem. That was like part of the Playboy lifestyle that character is selling.
Another difference, aside from Batman just being a bigger property at the time, there was also the sort of playboy that Tony Stark was a very weirdly 80s Hugh Hefner, almost wholesome ladies' man, dressed nice and was very charming, and a man of education and culture, and he was always like gallivanting these ladies all across town, and everyone, it somehow weirdly removes the seediness from it. And Batman, although he's also the playboy billionaire, but Batman can be a weirdly fetishized character because it's the leather costume and all the black and dark, and him being such a dark, brooding character. People are just wondering, it's like, okay, this is a very damaged person. And I guess there's a curiosity. It's like, okay, a damaged person like that, people just wondering, it's like, does that damage work its way into the bedroom? It's gotta.
Well, there's a few different things that are sort of bound up, I think, in the sexual prudishness around Batman in particular. Like the context, so this Frederick Wortham thing from the 1950s is that Frederick Wortham wrote this book called Seduction of the Innocent. That was sort of this anti-comics book in which one of the charges he makes in that book is that Batman and Robin facilitate homoerotic fantasies. He basically argued that Batman comics make children gay. If you don't think there's anything wrong with being gay, there's nothing really wrong with that. But I mean, also that's a huge misunderstanding of how media works. It's not going to turn anybody gay. That's ridiculous. But I mean, beyond that, it created just a lot of anxiety around sort of the sexual messages of these comics, and Batman and Wonder Woman in particular were kind of at the center of that. So you saw this shift after the Comics Code, which Wortham had a big effect on, was implemented in 1954, and then you have this assertion of the Batman family. You have sort of women brought into the universe to ostensibly cut down on those homoerotic readings. You could argue it makes things even more queer because a lot of the stories then involve Batman trying to come up with a way not to date or marry Batwoman, which is its own whole thing. But then the other thing that I think we should mention is the 66 Batman TV show and sort of the camp context of that. So that would be the one starring Adam West and Burt Ward as Robin. The entire Batman universe has been trying to move away from the camp context of that since then. And when you have something like the 89 Batman movie coming out, you had most of the marketing sort of directed at making sure that this wasn't the Batman that people were familiar with from the 60s television show, because that was the dominant cultural kind of perception of what Batman was. There was a lot of controversy actually in the 89 Batman movie that he was going to sleep with Vicky Vale. This was like a huge topic of conversation. So like there was all of this anxiety about, if Batman's going to be a sexual being, what does that mean? And I think a lot of that is bound up in discomfort with sort of the charges of homoeroticism, discomfort with that camp context, which played up some of that homoeroticism. So it's really been this complicated push and pull with this character. And I think that push and pull in Batman fandom and sort of storytelling in general, between constantly trying to like downplay those camp readings of Batman, is part of where this sexual discomfort comes from. They really want to emphasize that he has a very straight, very macho sexuality. And that's part of what's going on here, because you can think about the reactions to the Joel Schumacher Batman films, which play up the homoerotic context again with the bat nipples, right, and everything, and those like scenes of them changing into the costumes with the cod pieces and everything. I'm not saying that those movies were good, but also if you go back and look at the fan reactions to a lot of those movies, or those two movies rather, it was just the two, you will see a lot of homophobia sort of bound up in that. And that's not the reason the movie is bad, but you saw a lot of fans having a lot of anxiety around that time. And then you see Batman redone again in a very kind of gritty, deliberately very, very dark context in the Christopher Nolan films. So his sexuality, I think, is really interesting, the way it's bound up in this push and pull of like camp and grittiness. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I could go on and on about that, but like those are some of the contexts I think that are sort of bound up in these conversations.
Well, it was so interesting with the Nolan Bat films. They really neutered Bruce Wayne again.
And Robin is not in the movies.
There's no Robin. No one's counting Joseph Gordon-Levitt. But it was a thing where they did show him on one or two dates with beautiful women, but he seemed to show no interest in them. He was so in love with Rachel, and there was this weird pining thing. It struck me how neutered he was when in the third film, he slept with Talia. I don't know if they actually called her Talia in the movie, but he sleeps with Ra's al Ghul's daughter. And I remember just being struck as like, he seemed so asexual in those movies up to that point. Even, quote unquote, being in love with this woman, it felt very much like he held her on a pedestal and was in love with her and wanted to be there for her. This might be issues with casting. Not that there was any fantastic sexual chemistry where he couldn't wait to get her behind closed doors. One of the things that they actually, and I had a lot of problems with Batman v Superman and all the Snyderverse films, but one thing they did there is they did give a little bit of that back, where one of the first times we see Bruce Wayne in Batman v Superman, he's waking up in this beautiful bedroom in this massive bed, and there's a strikingly gorgeous woman asleep in bed, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a Batman who enjoys the Playboy lifestyle, and it's not just a disguise he puts in so people don't think he's Batman.
But that gets us right back to which sex acts are acceptable and which aren't, though, right? Because, I mean, you can just notice that every time the Batman's sexuality comes up, it's a controversy unless it's like a very macho, very patriarchal version of sexuality.
Oh, yeah, it's him standing there drinking coffee and this unconscious woman, Ben Affleck being all beefcake Ben Affleck, his shirt's off and he's in great shape. And whenever they show that scene, there's sort of an implication. It's like, oh, wow, he was such a sexual force that she's still asleep while he's drinking coffee and ready to go about the day.
Yeah. I know. Well, there's been a lot of controversy in the current. I mean, some DC insiders are going to know more about this than I do, but in terms of sort of the controversy about Tom King's Batman and the marriage to Catwoman that was supposed to happen and hasn't really happened, and there's certainly speculation that DC just doesn't want to go in that direction with the character. So it's just, there's a lot going on. I mean, the other notable Batman kind of comic sex scene I was thinking about was the one from Catwoman #1 from 2011, which I think is an Ann Nocenti comic. Batman and Catwoman have sex on a rooftop and the costumes stay on. And it's a very suggestive image of them on the rooftop together with sort of her straddling him and sort of lifting up his shirt to touch his chest. But I mean, she's very objectified in that image and sort of is the center of the composition, I would argue. So maybe that's why that one was like, okay. Maybe it was okay because it was in a Catwoman comic and not a Batman comic. But that was what kind of didn't start it, because Batman and Catwoman have had this will they or won't they thing for forever. But I mean, yeah, it's looking like the relationship has been broken up because the company doesn't want to go in that direction with the character. I mean, there's a huge context for this, like about they don't want marriage in superhero comics for certain reasons. There's like a logic that that's going to domesticate the character, that would be the end of their story, because obviously you can't live up to this individualistic sort of male hero fantasy if you have to be home at a time for dinner or something like that, right? There's just this weird logic to it. And, Dan DiDio had said in years past, sort of around the time of the New 52, where they sort of retconned a number of the DC marriages, like including the marriage of the Flash and Superman and Lois. He just believed that superheroes can't have happy personal lives, that they need to be so focused on the mission of heroism that to have anything else in their life would be a betrayal of their heroism. And that gives you a really good idea of sort of where this genre is coming from in terms of what relationships and domesticity and sex and romance mean. I mean, it almost reminds you of Victorian ideas about like masturbation, right? Like that, I mean, if you did it too much, it's going to sap your energy and you won't have the strength that you need to be the man that you need to be. And it's just, it's hilarious, but it's also really, really funny that these are conversations that we're having in the 21st century about heroes don't do that.
What's funny, and you touched on it, the marriage thing with the superheroes, they want to have it both ways, where they keep marrying off the characters, and then they keep realizing, oh, but it doesn't work when the character's married. It's like, hey, nobody put a gun to your head to do this.
Yeah, but, you know, they got to keep ongoing stories fresh, so it is difficult, but still.
I understand, but the problem is not realizing how difficult it is to undo these marriages, and I was so frustrated. And it really was the end of my Spider-Man fandom in comics in a lot of ways. And I've gone back to the series every now and then. But when they did the Mephisto erases Spider-Man's marriage thing, and it was pretty poorly written, it did this weird cosmic solution to a street-level hero, which didn't make sense. The comics never really recover from that. Now, they've had good runs since then, but it's still them trying to figure out a way to deal with Mary Jane and Peter. And now to the point where they're starting to hint around of getting them married again. It's like, oh, we're going to do this all over? It's like, okay, I get it. If you want to keep these characters single, keep them single. If you're going to marry them off, just realize that's a big thing. With Spider-Man, they said they felt him being married made him come across too old, but they figured him getting divorced would make him too old. So then they had to come up with this weird cosmic thing, which might have worked better for Superman because Superman deals with gods. But Spider-Man's whole thing is he's the guy who stops bank robberies and gets shot at. Why does Mephisto care about his marriage? Also, it was just lazy writing. I felt why they got rid of the marriage, because the writers kept saying, we don't know how to write him married. It's like, and I saw one writer said, it's like, what are you talking about? There's a huge advantage to him being married because you automatically have somebody to explain everything to. When Spider-Man's trying to explain to the writer, it's him telling Mary Jane what's going on. You have a strong character who is there and backing him up. And when she says, well, who's the Sandman? He can explain who the Sandman is to Mary Jane, and that way explain it to the readers in a much more organic way. They keep going to that well because I think wedding issues sell well. So when Batman and Catwoman got married, it made big news. They didn't even go through with it. They had Green Arrow marry Black Canary, and that lasted 3-4 years. And I was like, okay, why do you even make that step? And it just feels like the artists and the writers want to have that cool wedding thing and show Clark in the tux and all that, but nobody thinks these things through.
I do have to have like the grain of sympathy for it, just in terms of that is just the nature of long-running serialized stories. I mean, they're soap operas, so you're going to have things like somebody becomes a clone and then marries the clone, and then the clone dies, and then they come back from the dead. And, you know, I mean, those are just things that you're going to have in this genre. But I mean, there is like a built-in shelf life of superhero marriages. You know, there haven't been ones that have lasted past a certain point because they always get rebooted because you're always having to reboot these characters. And I mean, I'm sympathetic to that. I think it's interesting that it's always like the marriage is the first thing to go. And, you know, that again gets us back to those questions about, you can say makes Peter Parker seem so old, but it makes them seem a certain way in other ways as well, right? Because it depends on what audience they're thinking they're marketing these comics to. And if they think that they're marketing these comics to a certain male audience, like they think that the marriage aspect isn't the appealing aspect of the comic, they think that they're going to drive people away. And that's always been kind of a problem with diversifying the genre in general. There's only so far that they're willing to go because there's this idea, and I think it's not a well-founded idea that that's going to drive readers away, because who's reading Spider-Man comics these days? I mean, it's like, what is the average audience? It's like men like ages 25 to 45 or something like that. It's not teenagers that they're selling these things to.
No, it's not 14-year-olds.
Yeah, exactly. But you can see that they're often trying to like recapture that mythical audience. And I think that that's not going to happen. And they should probably let go of that. It's depressing that so many writers think that they can't write a marriage storyline that's convincing. I mean, they always go to the well of, well, the girlfriend or the wife will just get kidnapped all the time, and that's the story that we're just going to tell over and over and over again. And I'm like, yeah, or that's a story that you're choosing to tell. That doesn't have to be the story that you tell. You've always had sort of friends of the hero that are not necessarily in danger, but certainly like creating emotional stakes in the story just by being the friend of the hero. I mean, what are the adventures of Batman and Robin except for two people who care about each other in some capacity? I mean, father and son or whatever. And like one of them is always sort of getting in peril and the other one has to save the other one. There's a reason that people read kind of a romance into that, because it is very emotional, sort of the bond that they have. And why is that bond kind of accepted within this genre and other types of bonds aren't? And I'm saying that's accepted within that genre. There's been a ton of discomfort about that bond over the years, but just depending on how people are interpreting it, right? But I definitely think that idea that marriage can't work is a fallacy, and people are falling back on that because they're just not good at writing that type of story. But it's certainly a frustrating thing that keeps happening with sort of the retcons of weddings, and especially how they happen. I mean, I think I've even complained on this podcast before when we did the episode of WandaVision about how devastated I still am by the way that Vision and Scarlet Witch's relationship was dissolved.
That made both of them so much less interesting when they split them up.
Because that's a really good example of a relationship in which I think both characters became profoundly more interesting in the context of their relationship than they had been separately.
If they're not together, Vision is just the machine with a heart trope, but that doesn't work nearly as well if he doesn't have a specific someone to care about. If he's just Data from Star Trek Next Generation, and he's robotic and he comes across unfeeling, but he actually feels something deeply, well, that doesn't really show up well unless he has this woman that he loves to sort of show that you can crack that exterior. Without Vision, Wanda is just a very pretty woman, and they always draw her gorgeous, with vaguely defined powers, and they just often just throw her in bed with other characters. It's like, oh, she's going to be Hawkeye's girlfriend for an issue or two. Oh, Dr. Doom's in love with her for a few issues. And Wonder Man, she's in love with Wonder Man for 6 issues. She just never works as well as she does with, she's married Vision, she's a mutant, so she's sort of despised for being a mutant. He's a robot, a synthezoid, and no one understanding the relationship and everything that comes out of there. They both were so much more interesting as a couple. And it's amazing, and we did talk about this on the WandaVision episode, it's amazing in comics how long they've been split apart.
Yeah, I mean, that was a forever split. I mean, it's been since 1989, other than, some flashbacks and stuff. And I mean, just to your point about them being more interesting together, I mean, if they're not together, Wanda had that thing of being persecuted as a mutant like every other mutant in the Marvel Comics universe. In the relationship with the Vision, that story of persecution becomes an intersectional exploration of different types of difference, which is so much more interesting than just the usual mutant persecution story. And working that out in terms of the sex and gender politics of that relationship. Vision has doubts about his masculinity and what that means in the context of like a romantic relationship. It just makes both characters so much more interesting.
One character that you mentioned that probably gets not as much interest in their sexual proclivities as Batman is someone that you mentioned ever so briefly, Wonder Woman.
Yes.
There's a couple of reasons. First, BDSM and bondage were tied so much into the original stories of the character. And it's pretty well documented that the creators of Wonder Woman had a polyamorous relationship that involved, for what is pretty widely believed, that involved some not necessarily vanilla sexual hijinks behind the scenes. And that worked its way into the comics. every issue she seemed to be getting tied up by somebody. And then to more modern times, where more mature readers and more mature writers started diving into the logistics of her living on Themyscira. Okay, you have a island filled with beautiful women. What are the sexual implications of that? It's something that they've danced around a bit. One of the irritating things that they've done is not addressing it in the actual stories, but addressing it in interviews behind the scenes. So you have Gal Gadot saying, it's like, oh, yes, Diana definitely had same-sex relationships. It's like, okay, well, that's great that you say it on the interview, but there's nothing of that in the actual movie. It's like they want to pass to say, oh, we're sexually enlightened with the way we deal with these characters, but not in the actual product.
Yeah, there's been a lot of, use that phrase again, push and pull about queer representation in the superhero genre, particularly in the last 10 years when the companies are getting on the train of supporting LGBTQ causes is good for business. So they've been doing Pride anthologies, which both DC and Marvel released this month. So a comic book sort of anthology spotlighting LGBTQ heroes in both universes. And there's been a lot of sort of weirdness going on with some of that marketing and which characters get featured and which characters don't. And I know that there's been some controversy about Wonder Woman being left out of the DC Pride marketing because to put her in the marketing will declare that she's queer. And there's been, like hints and suggestions of that in various stories over the years, inevitably there would be, but they're not willing to go all the way with that. And there was a really interesting example with Marvel's Pride marketing with the character of Loki, who they're playing in the show. We're just sort of at the beginning of the show, so we're not really sure where it's going to go yet. There was sort of a thing in one of the early episodes of the show where his gender was listed as fluid, like on an identification card. So people have been saying that means the character is canonically gender fluid, but we haven't really seen that play out yet. There's been hints that we're going to see female Loki in the show. But anyway, with Marvel's Pride marketing, they released this cover of all their heroes for Pride, and Loki was in the original image that they released. Then they re-released it with Loki taken out of the image, and there was like a blank spot where he was. It was very clear that he'd been taken out, even if the previous image hadn't been there to compare. After fan outcry, they restored him in the image. So it's just, they don't know what they're doing with some of this stuff. And that's a particularly weird one to me because so much of the fandom around this character has happened since the character has become fluid in his gender and sexuality. That is a huge component of the character in the 21st century. Besides the fact that the character is gender fluid in the mythology that the character is based on. So just like the levels of strangeness going on there. So yeah, it's just the Wonder Woman one is just part of what is acceptable about her sexuality being quite overt in those comics from the 1940s is that she's supporting the war effort. And also that despite all of these sort of heavily implied sort of sapphic elements of those comics, her sexuality is still very heterosexual. Like Steve Trevor crashes on the island and she's like, it's the first man I've ever seen. I'm completely in love. And the idea that she's going to save men, she's going to redeem the world through the power of love is part of William Moulton Marston's feminist message that's bound up in that character. So, she's a fascinating character to have those kind of conversations. It seems so obvious that sapphic meanings would be bound up in that character. And yet you see, once again, the company, DC Comics, is very, very nervous about going all the way with that messaging and making that sort of fully canon in terms of our understanding of that character.
Going back to the original thing with Harley Quinn, and you're not too familiar with the show, am I right on that?
I'm aware of it. I'm not a regular watcher of it. People keep trying to get me to watch it, but I have so many things to read and watch.
I've watched the show. I enjoy the show a lot. It is a sometimes shockingly adult show and has some pretty bawdy humor, including one scene where Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman are attacking the bad guys in Gotham and end up fighting Poison Ivy, who fights them off with a plant that emits pheromones that gets all three of them so aroused that they lose their senses. And it's pretty heavily implied that the three of them have a sexual encounter.
That's Superman. One of his nicknames, sometimes a little bit derogatory, is the Big Blue Boy Scout. It's funny when they go about, oh, well, superheroes don't do that, and because of the marketing and all that, it's like, okay, that's fine. Then don't have Batman in Harley Quinn. And you sure as heck shouldn't be implying that he's going into a threesome with the other two, like, standard bearers of the superhero universe in DC.
But it's just really it's really interesting, right? Like what you're pointing out, like it's really interesting where they choose to draw the line. I mean, it's fascinating that they choose to draw the line about certain things. And I mean, DC Comics has been bad about that over the years too, in terms of which types of fan art and fan fiction they police. And unsurprisingly, it's usually been images featuring Batman and Robin. And you can understand that on the like level of that being a problematic relationship with the age and the nature of the father-son relationship with the characters. But I mean, still, I mean, you're talking about fan art that's re-envisioning the characters in like some radically different context. It doesn't have anything to do with the canon text, and yet they're very sort of stringent about policing that content.
I always appreciate the companies need to protect their IPs. If some mega alt-right or neo-Nazi group puts out a swastika bearing Captain America, you gotta shut that stuff down.
Though it's been interesting how they haven't gone after that as fervently as I've seen them go after certain fan art depicting erotic contexts.
Right, yeah, it's Captain America sleeping with Winter Soldier, that's off limits. We're gonna wait a little while until we remove the swastika. And I am not going by specific incidents, but you're sort of calling out, there just seems to be a feeling or anecdotal of, they really don't want male guy-on-guy fan art, which is, in general, it's people expressing through art their own sexuality. And a lot of times I think there's a healthiness to it because it's often young men or young women who are trying to figure themselves out, and they're expressing it through art with iconic characters, and there's value in a healthiness to that, and nobody has to look at it if they don't need to.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. That's the thing about fan spaces, right? I mean, sometimes you can see something you don't want to see, but you have a lot of choice about what you're consuming in a fan space because it's something that you have to actively seek out, right?
Yeah, this stuff doesn't pop up on my feed.
Mm-hmm.
If you have to search that hard to find something, if it's that many Google searches, it's not really hurting anyone.
And I mean, I'll go back on with the point that we were making about the things that they go after and don't get after. Like, we're not arguing that these companies are like actively in league with white supremacists or something. I'm just sort of making the point that they do seem to prioritize which types of IP infringement they go after and which types they don't. And that's like all I'm saying.
Is there a particular run of comics or even a character that you feel comics, DC or Marvel or even one of the other brands have done a good job expressing a healthy sex life or a healthy take on sexuality with them?
The question about whether a healthy sexuality is expressed is a really difficult one because that's been so behind the scenes until recently. Like, I mean, we talked about Tony Stark in the 80s sort of waking up in the bed of somebody, but it's still like the level of explicitness that you would have up until relatively recently it's heavily implied, but you're not sort of seeing sex acts on panel or that type of thing. I mean, I think some of the long-term relationships that we've mentioned, there's a lot that I like about the Lois and Clark relationship, particularly in comics sort of from the 90s moving forward, and some of the things that have happened in comics featuring those characters I've really enjoyed. I mean, obviously Vision and Scarlet Witch is one of my favorites. Barry and Iris has its moments. I mean, lots of these long-term, Spider-Man and Mary Jane, people, I don't know. I mean, the JMS run from featuring their relationship is still kind of like a favorite of mine in terms of, I mean, it wasn't perfect, but it's certainly in terms of depicting them having a healthy relationship with each other, I think it did a pretty good job.
That was really there to fix the relationship because by the point that JMS came on it, they were separated. It was him looking for a way to bring them back together and establish a healthy dynamic. He did a good job with it. And thank God, because they had a lot of problems with Peter and Mary Jane because when they got married, it sort of upset the dynamic of Peter's life, because the whole thing, it was like Peter Parker had bad luck. Didn't have luck with women. He never had any money. His job always stank. He always was late for class or missing classes. And then they had him marry a rich supermodel. It's like, okay, so there's Peter with a beautiful wife who's rich. How do you ever say he's unlucky? But JMS figured out a way to bring some interesting tension there. I liked the marriage. I know the whole unlucky in love thing was such a part of Peter's existence. I never thought it was always done well, because instead of making him seem unlucky, it often just made him seem like a loser. There's a big difference between a loser and somebody who just has bad, dumb luck on occasion.
Yeah, but I mean, that's again, them not being sure how to write that relationship. And I mean, even in the JMS run, it's like, I think the parts of that run that I like the best are when they're kind of negotiating their independence in terms of whether they want to be together or not.
Oh, yeah. My dog's losing his mind for some reason. Boomer, knock it off, you schmuck. So, Anna, what are you reading right now? What comics are you reading?
Oh, God, I'm supposed to be... Well, can I just add, like, one thing to, positive relationships? I think some of the most positive relationships in current comics are actually gay male relationships. I mean, like, I really like the relationship between Midnighter and Apollo, some of their comics, where they were apart and kind of get back together. And they're a particular kind of couple, since Midnighter is basically, like, incredibly murdery version of Batman. And, like, Apollo's kind of a Superman stand-in, but I've been very touched by their relationship at points. In one of their recent series, Midnighter makes a trip to hell to rescue Apollo, and it's very touching. And also the relationship between Wiccan and Hulkling in Marvel Comics. Their relationship has kind of happened in scattered places, like an issue here or there in certain specials and stuff. But the Emperor Hulkling storyline, which I believe won a GLAAD Award this year, is really, really wonderful. So in terms of positive relationships currently going on, I would definitely go with Wiccan and Hulkling as one of my faves.
Young Avengers is such a good series, but they've had challenges getting momentum for it. When the first Young Avengers series came out, it seemed like the first case of creators treating a Marvel series as seasons of a television show, where they came out with 12 or 24 issues or however long that first series was, and then they ended it saying, okay, we're going to come back with, and then the next thing was like Runaways and Young Avengers. They got away from, we're going to put out 300 issues of Amazing Spider-Man, or we're going to celebrate the 500th issue of Thor, whatever it was. That sort of became the standard in comics, doing these 6 to 12 issue runs of a comic and then shutting it down and then bringing it back under a slightly different name. Is like, okay, it's going to be Rocket Raccoon and Groot. After 12 issues, then it comes back with the new number one of the Furry Adventures of Rocket Raccoon and Groot, whatever it is. Young Avengers seemed to be the start of it, but because of the inconsistency of the series, that relationship and those characters, their development has been sort of stuttered because of it.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate that because of that, I don't think it's reached kind of the wide audience that it could. There sort of isn't an easily digestible series to just pick up, because it has been in these stops and starts and special issues and stuff. Even as I'm like, oh, well, you can catch like Wiccan and Hulkling in like Empire Elder Scrolls #2, and it's like, okay, that's already too much information, even if you're an active comics reader, right? We just need a series that you can pick up. Because I remember, again, in the WandaVision episode, I was mentioning that the children of Vision and Scarlet Witch, Tommy and Billy, are both gay, and, well, Tommy is like bi, I think, but anyway, that they're both queer, and people had no idea, right? So, like, I mean, those characters are present in the show, but that's not something that people are generally aware of, like, these characters. And I mean, I will be curious to see, like, whether those characters come back in the MCU in any capacity, because another of the things with the Marvel Pride marketing is that it seemed to be very clear that any of the characters that are in live action MCU adaptations were not included in the Pride Month marketing, Loki being the lone exception. There was a lot of tension and discomfort around that, as we talked about, because Star-Lord in the comics has been bisexual in the last year, and he was not included in the Pride Month marketing, and neither was Kitty Pryde, who is ostensibly bisexual in the comics now as well, going by Kate Pryde.
Oh, I forgot that they revealed she was bisexual in the comics.
Mm-hmm. They haven't done anything with it. She kissed one girl one time, and then they haven't done anything with it for a year, but ostensibly she came out as bi.
Yeah, I knew about Star-Lord in the comics who's been bisexual. Iceman, they had to do some weird work for him to be revealed as gay. That was such a weird thing where they brought Iceman from the past. So you had this teenage Iceman who came out of the closet, and then there's like, oh, wait a minute, there's now a 30-something or however old he is Iceman that's been in the comics, and now we're going to reveal he's gay. And I'm not criticizing the decision, but it's pretty obvious that this was a decision made when they brought the young Iceman, because it'd be an interesting story. You had to ignore the history of Iceman dating several women and never has been presented as gay up to this point. That's a challenging thing when you decide with characters that are 30, 40 years in comics to, in a very valid and needed attempt to diversify and address that the world isn't just filled with straight people, which for the longest time, both Marvel and DC had policies that there were no gay people in their comics, and finding a way to fix that. And it worked real well with North Star, probably the most famous first example of a gay character in comics, because John Byrne always wrote North Star as gay, but they just weren't allowed to say anything. So then when he came out of the closet, it's like, oh, yeah, of course. That makes perfect sense. And it tracks when you read the old issues, as opposed to Iceman. I remember the first time I really read Iceman as a comic was his miniseries, where he had fallen immediately in love with this woman who ended up being the daughter of a galactic-level supervillain, and him trying to rescue her.
I think with the Iceman example, though, that's a really interesting one in terms of fan gazes, because there's definitely a counter argument that I see made from people that did strongly read the character as gay prior to the gay reveal, and even cite that miniseries as incredibly gay. So it's like, there's sort of a fan narrative about that character, sort of a headcanoning of that character, that a lot of his sort of excessive performances of masculinity and immaturity are sort of like part of his closetedness. So I did just want to point that out because, that's definitely a dominant fan narrative with Bobby. And there's people pulling out panels, even from X-Men #1, where all of the characters are going to ogle Jean Grey, and Bobby's like, I don't even like girls, So there are these things that people pull out as I just am bringing that up because I think that that's a case where people have some issues with how it was handled. But it was a good opportunity to tell a story about the experience of being closeted and sort of being in denial about your sexuality. And they did try to kind of work that into the story of why hadn't he come out until now? And it's because he was sort of not at peace with his identity. And so you see him kind of in the 2 miniseries by Sina Grace, kind of working through what it means to come out in this point in his life. And you have interactions with his younger self, who's much less or much more comfortable with his sexual identity. So I think they ended up doing some interesting things with that. Again, I know some people have some issues with how it was handled, but still, in terms of a way to kind of retcon the story and make it make sense, I think that's actually a fairly decent example of an attempt to do that.
Bobby was definitely the character from those original X-Men that it made sense. Scott and Jean were always Scott and Jean, although they're playing a little bit around with Scott's sexuality now.
They are.
Beast had as many girlfriends as Kurt's had. Beast was sort of the ladies' man of the group.
Yeah, he reads as quite straight to me, not in positive ways always either. He can be a little bit aggressive and macho sometimes, although also has that ladies' man thing going on.
Angel was in the Tony Stark vein of the playboy millionaire, billionaire, whatever have you. Although there could be interesting stories there.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's plenty of queer himbo Angel fan art on the internet for those inclined to go looking for that.
Yeah, because he's always been the character presented as beautiful. This great looking guy, these magnificent wings, and which gives him a lot of chances to have the great scenes of him ascending from the heavens, with the 6-pack abs and the flowing hair and stuff. That can very easily be sort of tweaked into different forms of art.
Yeah, and he's certainly been a character that has some iconic instances of him appearing in bondage, in the Morlock storyline from Uncanny X-Men in the 80s, where he's taken prisoner by the Morlocks and kind of chained up with leather straps by Callisto, who's planning to marry him against his will. So he's had certain interesting BDSM storylines attached to him over the years.
Claremont goes to that well.
Yes, he does. I mean, you could say that about all of the X-Men, so it's not just Angel.
Angel gets a bit of it, has been pointed out at our friends over at Claremont Run. Storm gets a lot of that. And Rachel Summers also. Her run in especially the early issues, even longer, of Excalibur, she basically was wearing the gear she wore when she was leashed like a dog. Heavy bondage imagery there.
Oh, yeah.
So speaking of Excalibur, and as always, it's amazing having you on, let's talk about your podcasting world, including your stuff focusing on Excalibur.
Well, yeah, on the topic of sexuality, I know this episode will come out a little while, but so I host a podcast about the classic Marvel comic series Excalibur, so that's the one that ran from 1988 to 1998, and the core characters are Captain Britain and his lovely shape-shifting girlfriend Megan, Nightcrawler, Kitty Pryde, Rachel Summers is a member for much of the run, and some other characters kind of come and go over the course of the series. But yeah, we're doing every issue of that series, so every week on Saturdays we release a new episode, doing a deep dive on whatever issue we're reading that week. We usually have kind of academics on, or critics, or somebody that can lend some sort of unique perspective to some dynamic that's going on in that particular issue. We find it a really interesting series for exploring sort of questions related to the franchising of the X-Men line. It's like this X-Men team set in the UK, which is an interesting twist. It's a cross-dimensional series, which is interesting. It gives us a lot of stuff to talk about in terms of sex and gender and issues of representation, which myself and Chris Maverick and Andrew DeMann of Claremont Run are the three hosts of it, and we all love talking about those issues a lot. And the episode that just came out as we're recording this, came out today, is on Excalibur number 16, Warlord, which is kind of known as the sexy Nightcrawler issue. It's an issue in which he gets dropped into a sword and sorcery fantasy world, which is perfect for him as a swashbuckler, has sex in a hot tub with the evil queen of that world, and then more sex with her on a curved bed afterwards. She ends up being sort of an evil succubus, which is unfortunate. But anyway, lots of sexy content in that issue, and we talked a lot about the importance of depicting kind of sex-positive imagery with characters of different body types, which relates to discussions we had about Nightcrawler in that episode. And like, if you want to hear a serious academic discussion about the gender-fluid symbology of prehensile tails, I can highly recommend our podcast.
I recommend it too. It's a fantastic show. I was, and it's a point of pride for me, I was the first guest.
You were the first guest. You will have that on your resume forever.
Oh, it should be on my LinkedIn account. Last question about Excalibur, and I remember distinctly, sort of late towards the run of the show, they wrote off Rachel Summers. She's an interesting character where Claremont has shown an affection for her. He has brought her back several times. Because I even remember the cover of the issue where they said, this is going to be the last time you're going to see Rachel Summers in an issue of Excalibur. It seems like writers either love her or have no idea what to do with her. And maybe it's a thing of, it's hard to have Rachel Summers around as Phoenix when you also have Jean Grey around, often wanting to be called Phoenix. And also the weird dynamics of, she is the daughter of Scott Summers and Jean Grey, and trying to figure out what to do with that, where she's in a world where Scott Summers and Jean Grey are married. What are your thoughts on the Rachel Summers character? Do you think there's a particular writer who is best at using her? I mean, I imagine it'd be Chris Claremont, but are there other writers you think have a good beat on that character? Do you think she'll ever be able to sort of reach that upper echelon of X-Men characters because of the weird baggage with her history?
Honestly, I almost think this question comes back to sexuality with that character. She's always been a strongly queer-coded character. There are fan readings of that character as trans as well, which I find very compelling. You know, there's a thing in her backstory where she gets taken to Spiral's body shop and disappears for a while and then comes back as a very different character, which provides space for an interesting trans reading of that character. But certainly throughout her history, she's been a heavily queer-coded character and has not been made canonically queer, which is baffling to me because it's so entrenched in like the fan headspace that people just accept that that's true, but it's actually never been canonically made true. I mean, she's been a starring character in the sadly just canceled X Factor series that's part of the current X-Men line that was being written by Leah Williams. I think if you enjoy Rachel, you'll enjoy that series, but still very interesting that was a very queer series. You know, a number of the characters were LGBTQ, and yet Rachel's still not canonically queer in that series. So I really think that to push that character to the next level, like some of those sort of questions about her affiliations really kind of need to be explored. There's been a lot of discussion about whether that character might be entering a relationship of some sort with Kate Pryde now that she's openly bisexual, because that was a relationship that Chris Claremont teased for many, many years and, said at conventions and stuff. Anyway, another case of, saying the thing that is not really present on the page, that there's something going on with those characters. As yet, that has not happened. I think she's a wonderful character. I think she's a really fascinating character in terms of this character who is able to manage the Phoenix Force, like, successfully, right? Which is fascinating in terms of that's the push and pull of Jean Grey, that she can't handle this power and it destroys her and everything. And here's her daughter who can control it, the version 2 of her. And it would be so nice if part of that character's story was sort of doing something bold, like whatever it is with her sexuality, like whether she's asexual, whether she's lesbian, like whatever it is, just doing something forceful with her sexuality, I think would be really, really interesting, given how much of Jean Grey's story and her struggles with power are tied to sexuality as well. Her identity as Phoenix was very tied to kind of sexual excess, destroying planets through cosmic orgasms, and then her kind of literally becoming re-virginized when they find her body at the bottom of Virginia Bay and give her this new life. And then she goes back to her title of Marvel Girl, right? So there's kind of a going back to a less mature identity. I think the character of Rachel has so much potential. She's a character that fans love, and she's a character that has been mishandled so badly over her 4 decades of comics. But I hope for the best for her. It's disappointing that X Factor is being canceled, but hopefully she'll be showing up elsewhere in the X-Men line.
And it's sort of the problem with celebrity creators. They have the ability to do that shortcut where because Chris Claremont is one of the best known creatives in comics, and he's someone that they pay attention to and what he says makes the rounds in comics media. So he gets to say, oh yes, there was a relationship, or there were potentials of a relationship between Kitty Pryde and Rachel. Somehow that becomes canon, so he gets to present that without actually doing the work. So it gives a plausible deniability for the publishers to say, oh, no, they're not gay. Joss Whedon was bad at that, sometimes in different ways, because he was a celebrity writer, showrunner of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He got to say stuff. I think he heavily implied that there had been a sexual relationship between Angel and Spike. He would have very vague motivations for characters in the show that were never explained, and he would just at a convention say, oh no, this is why Xander did that. That's cheating. I even see it recently with the Russo brothers, and I like the Russo brothers very much, and I think they've done very good work in their stuff with Marvel. But the whole question of Captain America, was he able to lift the hammer in Age of Ultron? And them saying is oh yeah, he could lift it the entire time. Is no, there was nothing in those movies to show that he was able to lift the hammer. It creaked a little bit, and now you're changing the story, and there's so much of that in Marvel stuff. Partially because the Marvel universe is big, and there's a lot of questions, and not everything can be shown in the movies and whatever. But
that's why they need no prizes.
Yeah, that's why they need no prizes. But it does get frustrating because sometimes the things they say are counterintuitive, or they're a way to sort of have their cake and eat it too. It's oh yes, Wonder Woman has had same-sex relationships, but I'm just going to say that in an interview or at a convention. So when the marketers don't have to worry about how are they going to market this queer character, because she's not really queer in canon.
Yeah.
You can't have it both ways. Disney's been real bad with that. A few years back when they did the Beauty and the Beast movie, where they kept promoting that they were going to have the first gay character in a Disney movie, and they were just making a big deal out of it. And all it ended up was Josh Gad very, very briefly dancing with another man. You talked more about this than you actually showed.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, the really notable thing is that Disney does have queer content in terms of their television content, but they don't want to do it in their movies. So it's very clear that there's concern about international distribution that's sort of limiting what they're willing to do with a lot of these properties.
Well, on that happy note, Anna, plug any other of your pluggables. You already talked about your wonderful Excalibur podcast. But what else should people be checking out?
Yeah, so there's the Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow podcast, which is the Excalibur one. I'm also on a podcast called 3 Panel Contrast that comes out monthly. So the Excalibur one is every week. The other one is monthly. You can check out my book, Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero. You can find me on Twitter, Peppard_Anna. You can also find me regularly writing reviews for the website Comics XF, which is a wonderful, diverse, very queer positive comics website that talks about comics and culture and does, reviews every week of all of your favorite comics. I review the Nightcrawler-led X-Men book, Way of X, as well as Daredevil monthly for that site, so you can find me there.
All right, wonderful, Anna. As always, it's amazing having you on, and we're going to do this again soon.
That wraps episode 238. Big thanks to Anna Peppard. She is so cool. I would have her on every episode. Also, big thanks to Sarah Black and Chris Maverick. We talked for a half hour after a recent recording, and the content was so good I had to share a snippet. Next time on the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, the meat of my conversation with Sarah and Mav was about the recent developments in the Britney Spears conversation. Other subjects are also addressed. Till then, in the words of Jarf Hardin,
see you in the funny pages.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod, and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
Heroes don't do that.